Hi, I'm Eric Delora. I'm professor of musical theater in the theater department down the hall. Some of you may see me around the campus. I usually just go and hide in the theater most days and nights. So a lot of times people see me on campus and they're like, who is that guy that doesn't have any hair? So that's me. I hide in the theater department. So what we're about today, since I'm first, I'll give you if you hadn't read the title of our joint presentation, is Diverse Thoughts on Diversity. Both Heather and Jessica and I are on the members of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee here at Western Wyoming Community College. It's a new committee that President Dale had formed last spring. We were the first volunteer-told initiates, which is good. I think she asked for volunteers, and I'm happy to report that those of us that are on the committee are pretty committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, just both as a concept and a practice. So it's one of the things that for college accreditation and kind of out there in the real world, it's just important that we address issues that are, both contemporary and also try to address long-standing issues that need to be addressed. So that's one of the things which the formation of the committee is really all about, is looking at our print policies and practices here at Western Wyoming Community College and seeing how we can improve, not if we can improve, but how can we improve both the recruiting, the retention, the graduation of a more diverse student body. How can we affect change when it comes to some of the kind of the culture and environment that we experience every day when we're here on campus, and also kind of reach out and build bridges and make connections with our communities that support the college, and we mean that by all communities, communities of color, communities of income, social, across the whole social strata. So that's just kind of a little bit about why the committee's been formed and why it exists. And so we're kind of here just to share some of our own thoughts about very specific topics. So my topic briefly is, we'll deal with the We See You White American theater movement. So I'll just launch into this and basically just read my little presentation here. So in early 2020, so this past summer, amidst the protests and civil unrest regarding police violence against Black Americans, a group of 150 Black, indigenous, people of color theater professionals, otherwise known as BIPOC, which I may refer to it a couple of times, issued a statement entitled, quote, "We See You, White American Theater," end quote. Several days after the issuing of this manifesto, which was published in most or all of the major newspapers in the United States, the group issued a 25-page detailed list of demands that further sort of defined and explained what they meant in their opening one-page salvo. And it was primarily presented to the theater community, both professional and amateur theater community, in order for us to ponder how we deal with cultural competency, or in other words, how competent are we when we deal with other folks from other cultures. And specifically, it's a very long document and it's very detailed, but in a nutshell, what they are asking for is recognition and respect for enslaved Africans, recognition and respect for all 573 tribal nations, all Latinx, Asian, Middle Eastern, and other people of color, through safe and anti-racist policies and working environments in the professional theater. If you know anything about the professional American theater, what we mostly think of as Broadway or regional theaters that hire professional equity actors union, equity is the actors union that represents professional actors around the country. It's pretty much a white institution. While there are people of color, actors of color, and technicians and directors and designers within its ranks, much like many of the other arts organizations in the United States, it tends to be pretty monolithic in terms of the white sort of predominance of white folk in the ranks. And so it's no stretch of the imagination to then see that if it's predominantly not people of color that are running the organizations and the unions and the other activities, the activities that are reflective of that, the plays that we see on stage, will mostly reflect the membership of the folks that are in charge. So an additional 6 pages of this manifesto, the last 6 pages actually, address theater training programs at colleges and universities specifically in dealing with safe and anti-racist policies and learning environments, the decentralization of whiteness and the white Western aesthetic as the default, the inclusion of BIPOC writers, and culturally appropriate casting in all productions, and an end to perpetuating cultural stereotypes. So it's a pretty broad yet detailed howitzer pointed at the American theater establishment. So it got people to talking and thinking about what have we been doing in the last 100 years or more when it comes to American theater, and what could and should we be doing differently. To quote from the introduction of the document, quote, "Racism and white supremacy are cultural formations constructed to rationalize unjust behavior for economic gain, and eradicating them requires radical change on both cultural and economic fronts. We also wish to underscore that our emphasis on anti-racism should not be taken as an excuse to overlook sexism, ableism, ageism, heteronormativity, gender binarism, and transphobia, as our identities are intersectional." In other words, if you have an actor of color, they may not just be solely an actor of color. They may be female, they may be lesbian or trans. So there's a number of ways in which they may be disabled. So there are a number of ways where these things overlap, even within that, in those communities of color. So specifically, how does this manifesto apply to Wyoming with its 84% white, 8.5% non-white, and 7.5% Latinx population? Or, to be even more specific, how does this apply to our own college service area in Southwest Wyoming with a slightly higher 87% white, slightly lower 6% non-white, and comparable 7% Latinx population? So after I had read the documents this summer and was thinking about it and was reading articles back and forth from the various theater companies and theater organizations nationwide that most of whom signed on with the Black Lives Matter movement and agreed with the manifesto that came out and were agreeing to begin to think about how to do some things differently. So I was not alone in thinking, oh, well, gee, what does that mean for us here at Western Wyoming Community College, or in Wyoming, or in the West, or certainly across the United States? So I took it very specifically because I wanted to sit down and look at what we had been doing historically at the college over the last 30 plus years in that the theater department has existed. So the manifesto asks that the Western Wyoming Community College Theater Program think about what we have done and what we might do in the future. To be clear, we follow, for better or worse, William Shakespeare, who's a white Western aesthetic playwright, who wrote that, quote, "The purpose of playing or theater was and is to hold, as it were, a mirror up to nature, to show virtue her feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure," end quote. So, that's a quote from Hamlet, by the way. Though we also believe that the mission of our program at Western is, quote, "to see issues from multiple perspectives in the service of changing the world through storytelling." To those ends, then, I sat down and focused the lens on our production history, the 132 plays that we have presented over the last 30 years. So here's some statistics for you, so try not to go to sleep. Okay, stay awake, right? There'll be a test at the end, right? Just kidding. No, there might be. What I did find actually did not surprise me. So our stories did and do reflect the people that we serve in Southwest Wyoming, good or bad. 126 productions, or 90% of the stories that we've told in the last 30 years, are about white characters created by white writers and composers, in the case of musicals, which we produce a fair amount here at the college. Somewhat higher than the 87% of white audiences in our service area, 6% of our 6 productions, or 5%, were stories about non-white or Latinx characters, but unfortunately were written by white writers, which was much lower than the 13% of our non-white Latinx or Latinx audience here in our service area. So it's a sad example of cultural misappropriation and certainly not supportive of the college's and department's mission to, quote, see issues from multiple perspectives. Because if you have white folk writing stories about black folk or Asian folk, it's not really authentic. But we haven't done very much of that, so we're not as guilty as other people, right? In looking at ableism and ageism, which were, again, additional, were called out additionally in the manifesto, we had not produced a single play or musical in those categories created by members of that group, not one. Not a single play in 30 years. Though again, in 30 years, we have presented 3 productions, or 2% of our stories, about disabled characters, which were written by non-disabled writers, and 11 productions, or 8% of our stories, about older characters, but written by non-older writers. In the case of the heteronormativity, gender binarism, and transphobia, not only had we not produced a single play or musical about those characters in 30 years, but sadly, 26 productions, or 20% of the total number of the 132 stories which we have presented were about heterosexual characters, and so that means every single one were about heterosexual characters, and again, 26 productions, or 20% of the total, were created by non-heterosexual writers and composers. In the vernacular of the theater, we call that all gay guys. Okay? Only in the case of sexism had we had limited success. 10 productions were stories about women characters which had been created by women writers. Woohoo! We did something right. But as women currently comprise 48% of Wyoming's population, even in this case, we were not where we needed to be. Okay? So clearly the Western Theater program has a lot of work to do to begin to reflect the world around us. We do have safe and anti-racist policies and learning environments in the department and across the campus, but clearly in our department, we need to decentralize whiteness, to quote from the introduction of the manifesto, and the white Western aesthetic, and make space to include black, indigenous, people of color writers to tell even the 13% of our stories about non-white or Latinx characters that represent that 13% of our regional population. In addition, we need to recruit black, indigenous, people of color student actors to cast the roles appropriately and avoid perpetuating cultural stereotypes. Putting on a play about a black family but using white actors is not appropriate. That was something that the manifesto called out. It's also been an issue in the theater for a long time. We just don't do it, okay? But so rather than go and recruit actors of color to be cast in those roles, too often we make the choice to just pick a different play because we have a bunch of white actors, and so we'll tell a white story because it's just easier, because we can't seem to get those students to come to Western to be in our program. Not that we don't try, but we need to do a better job of that. Furthermore, we need to find and tell stories about disabled, older, and non-heterosexual characters created by members of those specific groups, and tell more stories about women created by women. As a gay male theater professional, that's me, I have championed the work of other gay male writers throughout my career, but in my 7 years at Western, mea culpa, true confession, I have not brought a single gay character to center stage. While at age 62, that's my real age, it might seem a little too late for me to change, I am definitely committed to making change by presenting plays and musicals in my few remaining years that allow students and community members at Western Wyoming Community College and in our extended communities in the Southwest Wyoming area to see issues from multiple perspectives that reflect the broader changes that are occurring and that exist in our society. Thanks. And I got all kinds of references if you want the footnotes later.
My name's Jessica Dean. I am English faculty here at Western. Some of you are in my classes. Hi. This is going to be extra credit for my class. Haven't told you yet, but it is. So So tell other people they come on Wednesday or watch the Zoom on Wednesday. I'm from Appalachia. I was born in Kentucky, spent most of my life in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee. I've been in Wyoming only for 2 years. So I'm going to bring y'all some stories from back where I'm from, but also a story from up the road here in Riverton. I just want to recognize Eric gave a good introduction of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee that we are a part of. I just want to say something a little different about it. Some of y'all might feel some kind of way when the word diversity, equity, or inclusion is put out there. You might feel resistance to it. You might feel, thank goodness, maybe they'll talk about my group of people or my life experience. Some of y'all might bristle at the phrase Black Lives Matter. Some of y'all might feel resistance when we talk about undocumented immigrants. And so my ask of you today is to give us a chance to expand your perspective a little bit. I'm a white woman, and my great-grandparents they've all been landowners in America. So the reality is I'm going to talk to you about diversity movements in land and food sovereignty, but I'm not a part of these groups that I'm going to tell you about. And I didn't know that I didn't know this stuff for a long time. I didn't realize that the reason my family was able to have land and was able to accumulate wealth was because they were white men. White women couldn't even get land back then. You definitely couldn't go get a loan to get land in Kentucky if you were black. The native people that lived on that land that they eventually owned, they were forcibly moved off what became my family's land. I never even thought about this stuff, y'all. Some of you have thought about this, and some of you know this story because it's your family's history too, and some of y'all don't want to hear it, and that's okay. My responsibility today, because I'm not a part of any of these groups I'm going to show you, is to show you how I've learned, what I've learned, and to point you to people that you can listen to expand your perspectives to, okay? So I beg you, if you feel resistance to hearing any of this from any of us, try to just open your perspective and realize you don't know what you don't know. And we have a responsibility to each other to hear stories of what other people have experienced, what our neighbors have, okay? So that's my little, please, if you're tuning us out, just tune it in for a second. Maybe you'll learn something too. So this photo was taken at CWC, Central Wyoming College, and I'll get into a little bit about what's going on there and in Riverton. We're going to talk about movements in land and food sovereignty. What do I mean when I say food and land sovereignty? I'm not just talking about farming, but I'm talking about food and land sovereignty. What does the word sovereignty mean? Anybody? Freedom. What else? Sovereignty. If you have sovereignty over something, what do you have?
Control.
What is it? Control. Freedom. Which that sounds like they are opposed, right? Do I have freedom or do I have control? Sovereignty does mean both of those things, right? You have freedom, control, what else? Ownership, yeah. All these things, okay? When I talk about food and land sovereignty, this idea of food sovereignty came about, actually the term named in 1996 via Campesina, which is a group of farm laborers. There are farm laborers all over the world. This is a group that came together to fight for the rights of farm laborers. Food sovereignty, the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. You've got control of your food supply. You've got freedom to grow and eat what you want. It fits your culture, fits the place that you're in. It doesn't damage the ecology, the water around you. Food sovereignty. You have enough. Okay? Land sovereignty. The right of communities and peoples to sustainable land-based livelihoods. Their right to have a democratic say in how land is used. That's that control piece, right? We can get together and we can say how we want to use our land. And an equitable share in the stream of social, environmental, and economic benefits from the land. Okay? So I'm going to give you, we're going to go on a little trip. I'm going to show you 2 examples of food and land sovereignty movements that are happening, why they're there and what they're doing. That's Grow Our Own up in Riverton, and the Black Mycelium Project, which is down south mostly. And then we're going to talk about ourselves, kind of how Professor Delora did at the end. What does this mean for me as a person? What do I do with this information? All right, so what's the issue for indigenous people? Things we got to talk about, things you need to learn about if you haven't. Removal from land, which is forced migration. Forced assimilation. A lot of my students don't realize that families, when they are put on reservations, Native and indigenous people, put on a reservation, forced migration. And the federal government says, we will give you food and some supplies, but you've got to send your kids to this boarding school across the country so that we can teach them how to be white people. Literally, that's what we need to kill the Indian in your kids to save the man. That's an actual quote by General Henry Pratt, United States Army. Our military forced this on families. You have to send your kids if you want food. Imagine if someone told you you have to leave your house and you now have to go live here, and the only way we're going to give you food, because we took away all of your growing techniques, we took you off your land, is if you let us train your kids the way we want you to. And a lot of the kids that were put on the trains and sent to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania was one of the biggest ones. They talked about how disgusting the food was. White bread and cheese sandwiches. They were like, we never had cheese. Y'all, I love cheese, but when you're a kid, you eat what you know and you grew up with. And that food is like your comfort food, right? You're taken away from your family. Your clothes that you're used to wearing, they're all taken off. You're given a uniform. Your hair's cut. And you were hit for speaking your native language. Forced assimilation. We have to talk about broken treaties. If y'all haven't learned about how so many of the treaties for indigenous people were broken with land, got to learn about that. Non-culturally appropriate food supplies. The food that the United States gave people on reservations wasn't what people were used to or what they wanted, wasn't what they were used to growing. Lack of autonomy on res land. There are so many rules about reservation land, what you can and cannot grow, if you have rights to the water or not. You don't have control over that land. And we've got a problem with revisionist history. Why don't most of my students know that kids were taken from their families? From indigenous people's families. Who writes the history books, right? That chapter was left out of all my history books growing up. I don't know if you heard about the boarding schools. But I was traveling this weekend. My dad and I went hiking, and he'd never been out to Wyoming. He wanted to stop and see some of the Oregon Trail signs. Anybody know where this sign is? 191. Yeah, 191. I'm headed up towards Pinedale. Somebody fixed the sign, y'all. I was happy to see this. To all the pioneers that passed this way, we have a monument to the pioneers, erected in 1947. Revisionist history means that some of the history is not told. Somebody added, to all the native people who were slaughtered for this stolen land. You've got to interrogate the history you're told is the truth and the primary truth, and realize what stories have not been told. What's the issue for Black and African Americans? 40 acres and a mule. That's what Lincoln said freed slaves would get, right? 40 acres and a mule. Andrew Johnson, after Lincoln was not president, Andrew Johnson did away with that. Took it back. Most students they learn the 40 acres and a mule part. They don't learn the Andrew Johnson part that is like, he took it away, okay? It didn't exist. The federal government took the land back. So that's an example of one of the certificates that was issued that was no good. So we got the same exact issues for Black and African Americans in America. I think 96% of African American land in America has been lost. And you got to talk about systemic racism, and some of y'all are like, oh, racism, like that doesn't, what's systemic racism? It doesn't exist. I'm not racist. Y'all, the whole system is built. It means it's built with racism in it. It's really hard to get it out of the bricks and the grout. So what happened to Black land in the South? My students listen to a really good podcast called Uncivil. It's a really good podcast if you want to listen to some of this stuff. But they have one episode called The Deed. So example, a Black family was deeded land through the 40 acres and mule stuff. What happened in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, the Jim Crow laws were happening. Do you think you could go, if you're in Alabama, you could go to the courthouse and get your deed transferred when grandma died? If you were Black? No. So come a few years later, the family is like, whoa, we actually want to sell this land and buy land somewhere else. And the court said, you don't actually own this land because you don't have the right paperwork. But they couldn't get the paperwork because of racist laws. That's just one example. There are thousands of examples of how this stuff worked. Black families couldn't get loans at the bank to buy land. White families could. So it created this land grab in the U.S. when slaves were freed. It wasn't fair. And so we've got the same exact problem and the same problem of histories that aren't told. Here's Grow Our Own in Riverton. They're growing crops that they, like choke cherries and stuff like that. This is started by a college student, and poet Dara Perez, good voice oak. This is really good. I'm not going to show it, but if you want to watch and learn about this, there's a great episode on PBS, Wyoming, called Food Sovereignty in Indian Country that Dara did. It's all about this movement to create food sovereignty in and around the Wind River Reservation. This is the Black Mycelium Project. Mycelium is the underground part of a mushroom, y'all. Mycelium does amazing stuff for the soil. This is kind of in the South mostly. Black, queer, transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. Mostly in the South, but also in Washington State, Illinois. Nurturing a network of interconnected land projects. Y'all, there's a lot of history of pain about, rightfully so, with farming and Black and African American folks in America. And that's a lot of reason why some people left the land. But they're saying we need a chance to go back to the land. We need to get some of our land back. And we need to have some autonomy. And how do we heal and grow on this? And so they're doing this project to try and save money to enable Black and queer, transgender, non-binary specific, like Eric was talking about, sometimes people are part of more than one group that's been marginalized. This is a project with farming with that example. And that's Dallas, who's one of the founders. Practicing reciprocity for our land and the community is our attempt to grow towards sovereignty. The Harriet Tubman Freedom Farm visions a just society where people have access to what they need to live as they see fit. People who can feed themselves are people who can lead themselves. So what's our work? Each of us has a different part in this because we all eat food. We all need land, whether we own it or someone else owns it. We all depend on land to survive. Dominator culture has tried to keep us all afraid, to make us choose safety instead of risk, sameness instead of diversity. Moving through that fear, finding out what connects us, reveling in our differences, this is the process that brings us closer, that gives us a world of shared values, of meaningful community. This is Bell Hooks, one of my favorite teachers from Kentucky. So I'm asking you to try not to be afraid of diversity and difference. See what you can find to connect to other people that have different life experiences than you. Here's how you can take responsibility and take action. So first, reckon with your personal history. Who are you? Who Who are you? How do you fit into land and food sovereignty? Where do your people come from? Reckon with your community history. Whose land are you on? And what don't you know? There's a cool website, Native Lands. You can actually like type in, like I grew up mostly in Loganville, Georgia, and I can type that in and it zooms in and it tells me that that's Muskogee Creek land and some Cherokee. Whose land are you on? nativeland.ca. You got to reckon with that. If you've got sovereignty, if you feel like you've got sovereignty, some people do. They feel like I got land, I can provide for myself, I got enough food, I get to eat what I want. Think about how you could help others get it. And if you want sovereignty, if you don't feel like you do, ask others to join you, like Dara, Good Voice Elk, did up in Riverton. She was like, wow. She started Grow Your Own during COVID, when the grocery stores all got out of everything, and she was like, we've got to start growing our own. How can we do this? And it's become huge. There's community gardens all over Riverton in like one season. So this is my ask of y'all. Who are you? Whose land are you on? Do you have sovereignty? How can you help somebody get it? Do you want sovereignty? Ask others to join you. Thank you all.
Hi, I'm Heather Pristash. I'm another member of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and also another member of the English department here at Western. And one thing that I will also say about our committee and about our group, just to throw out, if this is an area that you're hearing and you're like, yes, I feel strongly about this, I'm glad this is happening, I'm here for this, get a hold of us, because we're doing plenty of things where we want to pull in student voices, and students are a very important part of the community. As much as, you know, I have things that I'm aware of here about diversity, I am one white chick who's, you know, in her 40s and a professor. Like, that's my point of view. I need to pull in other voices, and yours are a big part of that for us. So if that's something you're interested in, H. Pristash, westernmiami.edu, I'm officially asking. You can also get a hold of Jess and Eric or any committee member. Track us down, throw things, whatever. We're totally interested in hearing voices. All right, so to head in a slightly different direction, diversity and knitting. So when I say a knitter, close your eyes. A knitter. Picture a knitter. What are you thinking of? Granny? Grandma? Okay, what other things? Describe the person you're seeing.
She has like a bonnet on.
She has a bonnet on. And also, she has a bonnet on. So you're seeing a woman. Who's seeing a woman? Raise your hand. Okay. What else? Said granny. Who's seeing an older woman? Raise your hand. All right. Who's seeing a white woman? Raise your hand. Yep. So, those are the things that you often get. Oh, knitting. Definitely old, definitely female, usually white. These are like the three perceptions that a lot of people immediately have. It's funny because I learned to knit in my 20s, and I had people giving me grief like, aren't you a little young for this? Like, dude, it's, you know, it's not like you have to have ID. Like, I'm allowed to go buy sticks and string. They let me do this. So, but there's still this really strong perception. However, it's not accurate. And I've knit for almost 20 years. Hey. And I've researched knitting for a very long time as well. It's one of my big research areas. And one important thing to note is actually the ages of people who knit, it's pretty evenly broken out across the spectrum. Like, yeah, there are older people who knit. Absolutely. There's also younger people. There's all sorts of ages. It's maybe very slightly tilted to middle age here, but not by much in this 2017 study. Okay, issues of gender. Yes, at this time, knitting is gendered female in our society. Hasn't always been that way, and I could go into a long thing on that. Also, for people who think that it's unmanly to knit, I have a 6'4", big, burly, retired truck driving veteran father who would like to have a word with you because he knows how to knit. So if he's, if it's macho enough for him to do, I really defy anyone else to say that they're too macho to knit. Just putting it out there. However, race. And I've looked at a fair number of these studies. Most of them really don't deal with issues of race, which says something to me. People are not thinking about this. Certainly doesn't say to me there's not a problem. Kind of hints the opposite. There is a strong history of people who are not white who are knitting and crocheting. I've got two of my personal faves up here because, it's a small screen. Sojourner Truth. You guys know who she is? I'm getting some nods. Activist. She was a slave. She got to freedom, and then she pushed for emancipation for others. Women's rights activist. General, just tough, impressive human being. Some of the most famous pictures of her are with her knitting. And actually, that's done deliberately because they wanted to show, oh, she's a woman like you, to other women, to make her seem more accessible. She's like other women you don't have to, this is an accessible person. And the other person who I just love, and I'm just taking any excuse to tell somebody about her, is Zenobia Bailey, who is a fiber artist, crochet artist. And this is all her work over here and her. She describes her work as very funk-inspired and has a very spiritual vibe to it and lots of repeated shapes and meditative. It's really cool. But there's a lot of people who knit who aren't white. So people tend to perceive, they think of knitter equals white if they are a white person. Sometimes people who aren't white think knitter equals white, and therefore I can't do it, or I shouldn't do it, and that's a problem. We have people who don't look like knitters, which is like, do you have two appendages that could work, sticks and string? Hands, feet, teeth, something. You look like a knitter. But when people are not perceived as looking like knitters, we've got plenty of cases where they're not welcomed into the community. And that has real impact. For years, there have been a lot of tales of people getting treated differently in stores, particularly by POC. I mean, you've got people who go into stores, and even if the people working there are not deliberately thinking like, I want to be mean and I am racist and brr, they're thinking, doesn't look like a knitter, and will follow that person. Or doesn't look like a knitter, so they will be very patronizing to that person. And there's lots of cases where people are scared out of the craft. Designers, particularly black designers, but non-white designers in general, there's been a lot of discussion of people who are creating patterns and selling them online, and they have to have a picture of somebody modeling it, right? You want to see what it's going to look like. And a lot of those designers have said, if I put my picture on it, it does not sell. I got to go find a white friend. The sales are different. And there are plenty of those designers who have said, okay, what do I do here? And their classes or yarns might not be as popular. Actually, it's interesting. For as many male knitters as we have a lot of like very famous white male knitter teachers in knitting, which is interesting. We have a large number of white women, and I can think of I can count on one hand the number of big teachers who are non-white. It's a really notable thing. Same with yarn companies. And selling yarn, you might be like, yeah, selling yarn. This is big business, people. People make major money. This is an industry, in the billions with a B. And people who hand dye yarn, frequently, if they are a person of color and they put their identity out there, there has been an issue. Oops. And you have had BIPOC knitters try to start this conversation and say, hey, we're experiencing this problem, and not be listened to. This has happened repeatedly. Suddenly in 2019, boom, it happened. So basically, the quick breakdown is this woman, Karen Templar, white woman, runs a very fancy accessory company that's very, very nice, pricey knitting accessories. And she posts that she's finally going to get to take her big trip to India. Exotic India. And starts talking about it's like being offered a seat on a flight to Mars. And if I can go there, I can do anything. And it's okay. As somebody who's always wanted to travel there, I get ooh, this is something totally different. At the same time, if you're from there, how would you feel hearing it compared to Mars? Or hearing a trip to my country is the biggest struggle you can see yourself overcoming. It's the biggest hurdle. It's the biggest adventure. Dang, I grew up there. It's a place where people live. That is going to make you feel some kind of way. And people hear that a lot. So she said this on her blog, and people at first oh, yay, good for you. And then people start kind of bringing up questions. Karen, I'd ask you to reread what you wrote and think about how your words feed into a colonial imperialist mindset towards India and other non-Western countries. Multiple times you compare the idea of going to India to the idea of going to another planet. How do you think a person from India will feel to hear that? So discussion started. And Templar did wind up kind of realizing how that sounded, rolled it back. But this time it kind of opened the floodgates, and it was fascinating because the conversation primarily hit Instagram. There's a ton of knitters, of designers, and of just regular knitters and yarn sellers on Instagram. We're everywhere. So you started to see people really get into talking about it and really make a point to put themselves and their faces and their skin in the dialogue. And it got really interesting online for a few months. And it was also kind of fascinating that it's particularly went to Instagram stories, which was a way that it could be a little quicker and more ephemeral and feel a little safer for people. So that's kind of interesting. But it was kind of fascinating because this is something that had been discussed for years. And suddenly, all the pieces came together and people were listening. And people were arguing. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't like holding hands, kumbaya, hoo-ha, no. But it got to a point where people were really saying, I'm going to listen to other people who might have different experiences than me, other voices that I might not be listening to. And this was a huge shift in knitting. So what's happened with this? as part of this, you had a lot of yarn companies and magazines specifically saying, like they often hire designers to do stuff out of their yarns to help sell their stuff, and specifically saying, you know what, you're right. We haven't hired any non-white designers. We need to get on that. We need to look for BIPOC designers to work with. We need to, if we're a magazine, we need to look for yarn companies owned by a more diverse array of people. You had a big reach of people being aware of who they're following on social media. You had a big reach of people thinking about who they're buying from, and a lot of discussion. So why is this worth us talking about? Like, I realize I may well be the only knitter in this room. Why do you care? Because it's a really interesting microcosm. It's very easy for us to think about diversity as this big, huge umbrella issue that doesn't impact, your daily life, maybe. Or that it's a big, huge umbrella issue that is out there, but it's not interwoven with your daily life. But it is. It's really easy to overlook things like, hobbies and free time and think, oh, that's not a place where this comes into play, but it does. So part of the reason that I think it's interesting to look at, even and maybe especially for people who aren't a part of it, is to think about what are the communities that you're a part of. I personally, as somebody who does think about and care about these issues, still had a lot of awakenings based on this and going, dang, look at who I follow on Instagram. Look where I'm spending money. I need to do better. Thinking about what you're doing and how it could be better is important and shouldn't require these kinds of huge social media blow-ups. So basically, even if you personally don't have to consciously think about them, issues with diversity, equity, and inclusion are around you all the time, and they affect people's lives in real ways.